What if the oldest city on Earth is not lost to the desert, not buried beneath jungle vines, not drowned under rising seas, but frozen? What if the first capital of human civilization lies not in Mesopotamia or the Nile Valley, but beneath 2 miles of Antarctic ice, perfectly preserved, waiting in a silence so complete it swallows time itself? Imagine standing at the bottom of the world, where the wind doesn't blow, it screams. Where the temperature doesn't drop, it murders. Where the ice doesn't melt, it remembers. Antarctica, a continent so hostile to life that even bacteria struggle to survive on its surface. And yet, deep beneath that ice, radar pulses have detected something that should not exist. Patterns, geometries, structures that whisper of right angles and deliberate design, of streets and plazas, of walls and foundations. Formations that look less like random geology and more like the ghost of a city, sealed away from human memory for longer than our recorded history can measure. If you're drawn to the kind of history that sleeps between ice and impossibility, between accepted chronology and forbidden questions, then stay with me. And if this journey resonates with you, let the algorithm know. Not for my sake, but so others who ask the same questions might find their way here. Tell me, too, where you're listening from tonight. What continent shelters you as we explore the one that remembers what we've forgotten? We are told a story about Antarctica. It is a simple story, clean in its lines, reassuring in its certainty. Antarctica, we learn, has been frozen for at least 34 million years. The ice sheets that entomb it are ancient beyond human comprehension, predating not just our species but our entire evolutionary lineage. The continent itself, we are assured, has been uninhabitable since long before the first hominid stood upright on African soil. It is a dead world, a white wasteland, a place where nothing has ever thrived and nothing ever will. The accepted timeline is clear. Ice formed, ice remained, ice will endure. Humanity arose elsewhere, in warmer cradles, and Antarctica played no role in our story. It is a footnote to human history, not a chapter. But what if that story is incomplete? What if the timeline we accept so readily is only partially correct, a fragment of a much larger and far more unsettling truth? Let us begin with what the ice itself reveals. Antarctica is not one uniform sheet of frozen water. It is a complex, dynamic system of ice masses, some older than others, some thicker, some thinner. And beneath that ice lies bedrock. Actual land, with mountains and valleys, with coastlines and river systems, with topography as varied as any other continent. We forget this because the ice blinds us. We see only the white surface and assume uniformity. But the land beneath is not uniform, and neither is its history. Recent geothermal mapping has revealed something extraordinary. Beneath the western ice sheet, there are regions of unusual heat. Geothermal anomalies that suggest volcanic activity, yes, but also areas where the ice is thinner than expected, where meltwater lakes exist in eternal darkness, where the temperature at the bedrock is not the brutal cold of the surface but something closer to survivable. These are not small pockets. Some of these subglacial lakes are the size of major cities. Lake Vostok alone, buried beneath more than 2 miles of ice, is comparable in size to Lake Ontario. It has been sealed away from the surface for millions of years, yet it remains liquid. What else might remain liquid in the darkness beneath the ice? What else might have remained viable long after the surface froze? Now consider the coastlines. Using ice-penetrating radar and gravitational satellite mapping, scientists have reconstructed what Antarctica looked like before the current ice sheet reached its maximum extent. The results are startling. The continent we see today is not the continent that existed even 12,000 years ago. During the last glacial maximum, sea levels were lower, much lower. Coastlines extended further. And crucially, not all of Antarctica was equally frozen. There were ice-free zones, particularly around the perimeter, particularly in regions that today are drowned beneath ice and ocean both. Ancient maps suggest something even more provocative. The Piri-Reis map of 1513, for instance, appears to show the coastline of Antarctica, not as it looks today, but as it might have looked without ice. The level of detail is extraordinary. Bays and inlets, rivers flowing to the sea, mountain ranges in positions that correspond to known subglacial features. How could a 16th-century cartographer possess such knowledge? The map itself claims to be a compilation of older sources, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great or before. If true, this implies that someone, at some point in deep antiquity, mapped Antarctica when it was at least partially ice-free. Someone saw that land. Someone knew its shape. This is not fringe speculation confined to the margins of archaeology. The existence of these maps is documented. Their accuracy, particularly regarding subglacial topography, has been verified by modern ice-penetrating surveys. The question is not whether the maps are accurate. The question is, who made the originals and when? Pyramidal formations have been identified on satellite imagery of Antarctica. They appear, at first glance, to be mountains. And perhaps they are only mountains. But their symmetry is remarkable. Their angles are suspiciously precise. Four-sided, steep-sloped, rising from the ice with a geometry that feels less like erosion and more like intention. Natural formations can be symmetrical, of course. Wind and ice can carve stone into unexpected shapes. But when multiple such formations appear in relatively close proximity, each exhibiting similar angular precision, the question becomes harder to dismiss. Are we looking at peaks shaped by ancient glaciers, or are we looking at something built, then buried, then exposed again as the ice shifted across millennia? Beneath the ice, ground-penetrating radar has mapped what appear to be river systems. Not modern rivers, of course. There is no flowing water on the surface of Antarctica today, but ancient riverbeds, carved into bedrock, branching in the characteristic dendritic patterns of drainage networks. Rivers require rain. Rain requires a climate warm enough to support the hydrological cycle. These rivers tell us that once, long ago, water flowed freely across this land. Plants grew. Animals grazed. Life was possible. How long ago? That is the question that makes the ground shift beneath our certainty. The standard answer is millions of years, back when Antarctica was part of Gondwana, before it drifted south to its current polar position. But what if some of those river systems are younger? What if some of them were active not millions of years ago, but tens of thousands? What if the ice came not in one ancient event, but in stages, and what if, during the intervals, there were windows, brief, precious windows, when the land was habitable again? The Younger Dryas event, approximately 12,800 years ago, was a period of dramatic and sudden climate change. Temperatures plummeted. Ice sheets that had been retreating surged forward again. Sea levels, which had been rising, stalled or even reversed. The causes are still debated: meteor impacts, volcanic eruptions, shifts in ocean currents, but the effects are undeniable. It was a catastrophic climate disruption that lasted roughly 1,000 years. Civilizations that may have existed before the Younger Dryas would have faced an existential crisis. If such civilizations were situated in coastal regions, or in temperate zones that suddenly became uninhabitable, they would have been forced to migrate, adapt, or perish. What if some of them were in Antarctica? What if, before the final freezing, before the ice locked the continent away forever, there was a population there, thriving in a geothermally warmed valley, sustained by rivers fed by glacial melt, protected from the worst of the ice by geographic fortune? And what if, when the climate shifted, when the cold became absolute, they had no choice but to leave, carrying with them only memory and the barest fragments of their former world? This is not idle fantasy. This is pattern recognition. Because the more we look at ancient civilizations that emerged after the Younger Dryas, the more we see commonalities that are difficult to explain through independent development. The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Indus Valley, the pre-Columbian cultures of the Americas, all of them appear, seemingly suddenly, with sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, agriculture, engineering, and writing. They do not show the slow, fumbling progression we would expect from societies inventing these concepts for the first time. They show mastery. They show memory. What if they were remembering Antarctica? What if the knowledge they carried was not invented in the river valleys of Mesopotamia or along the banks of the Nile, but learned in a place now lost, a place where the first true human civilization rose and fell before the ice came to claim it? Consider the anomalies in ancient cosmology. Many early cultures describe a homeland of the gods in the far south, a place of cold and darkness, a place from which their ancestors came. The Greeks spoke of Hyperborea, though they placed it in the north. But what if the direction was confused over millennia of oral transmission? What if the place beyond the known world was not north but south? Not a land of eternal sun but a land of eternal ice, remembered only in fragmented myth. Consider, too, the strange universality of flood myths. Every major ancient culture has one. A great deluge, a world-ending catastrophe, a time when the waters rose and the old world was swept away. The biblical flood, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Hindu Puranas, the Aztec and Mayan legends, all of them describe the same event with eerie consistency. Rising seas, drowning lands, the survival of only a few. We know that sea levels did rise dramatically at the end of the last ice age, as glaciers melted and poured into the oceans. Coastal settlements would have been inundated. But what if the most important settlement, the capital, the origin point, was not merely flooded but frozen first, then forgotten, then erased from all maps except the oldest, the ones drawn by those who escaped? Antarctica is unique among continents in one crucial respect. It is the only one that has been entirely removed from human access for the entirety of recorded history. We have no ancient texts describing it. No explorers reached it until the 19th century. No indigenous population survived there to tell its story. It is a blank space in our historical record, not because nothing happened there, but because the ice ensured that whatever did happen was sealed away so completely that even memory could not survive. There is a persistent idea in archaeology that civilization begins with agriculture, that sedentary farming communities give rise to surplus, surplus gives rise to specialization, specialization gives rise to cities, and cities give rise to writing, law, and everything we call civilization. This is the narrative we teach, and it is true as far as it goes. But what if it is not the whole truth? What if agriculture was not the beginning, but the rebuilding? What if the first human societies were not farmers at all, but something else, something we have not yet imagined, because we cannot conceive of a world before the one we know? The Antarctic Peninsula, the finger of land that reaches toward South America, was not always as frozen as it is today. Geological evidence suggests that as recently as 6,000 years ago, parts of the peninsula were ice-free or nearly so. This does not mean the entire continent was temperate, but it does mean that habitability was not impossible. Microclimates can exist even in hostile environments. Geothermal vents, subglacial lakes, volcanic heat sources, all of these could create pockets of relative warmth, oases in the ice, places where life could cling on long after the surrounding land became uninhabitable. What if such a place existed not 6,000 years ago, but 16,000? 26,000? What if, during the last interglacial period, roughly 130,000 years ago, Antarctica was not a frozen wasteland but a functioning ecosystem, complete with forests, rivers, and fauna? We know that during interglacials, ice sheets retreat dramatically. We know that sea levels rise, coastlines expand, and climates moderate. We know that life spreads into regions previously locked in ice. Why should Antarctica be exempt from this pattern? Anatomically, modern humans have existed for at least 300,000 years. Our species is not young. For most of that time, we have no cities, no writing, no grand monuments. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. For 290,000 years, our ancestors left almost nothing behind that we can recognize as civilization in the traditional sense. Does that mean they built nothing, knew nothing, achieved nothing? Or does it mean we are looking in the wrong places, asking the wrong questions? What if the reason we find so little evidence of pre-agricultural civilization is because it was located in the one place we cannot easily excavate? What if the first great human experiment in settled life, the first city, the first concentrated population, was not in the Fertile Crescent but at the bottom of the world, in a sheltered valley warmed by volcanic heat, surrounded by glaciers but habitable within its microclimate? And what if, when the climate turned, when the ice surged forward and the geothermal warmth could no longer hold it back, the inhabitants fled, scattering to every other continent, carrying with them the memory of what they had built, the knowledge of what was possible? This would explain the sudden appearance of sophisticated cultures across the globe after the end of the Ice Age. It would explain the shared myths, the flood legends, the stories of lost homelands. It would explain why so many early civilizations possessed advanced astronomical knowledge, because their ancestors had lived in a place where the stars wheeled differently, where the southern constellations dominated the sky, where the sun and moon traced unfamiliar paths. A people displaced from Antarctica would carry that astronomical knowledge with them, and it would be embedded in their cosmologies, their calendars, their sacred structures. Look at Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey. 11,600 years old, predating agriculture, predating pottery, predating everything we thought necessary for such monumental construction. Massive stone pillars, carved with animals and symbols, arranged in circular patterns that suggest astronomical observation. Who built it? Hunter-gatherers, we are told. But hunter-gatherers with knowledge, with organizational capacity, with a vision of something greater than mere survival. Where did that knowledge come from? Where did that vision originate? What if Göbekli Tepe was not a beginning, but a memorial? What if it was built by people who remembered a greater structure, a greater society, and were trying to recreate it in a new land with new materials under new skies? What if they were refugees from a frozen capital, carrying with them the architectural principles, the astronomical alignments, the spiritual symbolism of a homeland they could never return to? Antarctica holds more ice than all other glaciers on Earth combined. That ice is, in some places, nearly 3 miles thick. Beneath it lies an entire continent, largely unexplored, largely unmapped at ground level. We have radar images, gravitational surveys, seismic readings, but we have no boots on the ground, no excavations, no direct examination of what lies beneath. If there were cities under that ice, we would not know. If there were roads, monuments, temples, libraries carved into stone or built from materials we have not yet imagined, they would be invisible to us, locked away in a frozen archive that has not been opened for 12,000 years or more. Consider what ice does to organic material. Preserves. Bodies buried in ice remain intact for millennia. The iceman Otzi was preserved for 5,000 years in an alpine glacier, his clothing, his tools, even the contents of his stomach perfectly intact. If a civilization existed in Antarctica before the final freeze, and if it was buried quickly by advancing ice, then everything would be preserved. Not scattered, not decayed, not eroded by wind and rain, but frozen in place, exactly as it was at the moment the ice entombed it. What could such a civilization have looked like? Let us speculate, not wildly, but within the bounds of what we know about human capacity and environmental adaptation. Imagine a valley, perhaps 50 miles across, nestled between mountain ranges that shield it from the worst of the polar winds. At its center, a geothermal rift, a crack in the Earth's crust where heat rises continuously, warming the ground, melting ice, creating a zone of relative habitability. Rivers flow from the surrounding glaciers, fed by summer melt and geothermal warmth, converging in a central lake. The temperature at midday might reach 50 degrees Fahrenheit in summer, cold by our standards, but livable with adequate clothing and shelter. Around this lake, a settlement grows, not of wood, for trees are scarce, but of stone quarried from the mountains, of ice blocks cut and stacked, of materials adapted to the environment. The people are not primitive. They have fire, clothing, tools sophisticated enough to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Survival in such a place requires intelligence, cooperation, and technological innovation. They develop clothing from animal hides and insulating grasses. They build structures partially underground, using the earth itself as insulation. They learn to predict the weather, to read the ice, to understand the rhythms of their environment in ways that lowland peoples would never need to. They are isolated, yes, but isolation fosters depth. Without easy trade routes, without the distractions of neighboring rivals, they turn inward. They develop astronomy to a high degree, because in Antarctica, the stars are spectacularly clear, unpolluted by dust or humidity, and the long polar nights provide endless opportunities for observation. They map the heavens with precision. They track the precession of the equinoxes, the cycles of the moon, the movements of the planets. They encode this knowledge in stone, in symbols that will outlast language, in structures aligned to celestial events. They develop mathematics because engineering in such an environment demands precision. To build a shelter that will not collapse under snow load, to construct an aqueduct that will carry geothermal water without freezing, to calculate food stores for the long, dark winter. All of this requires sophisticated numerical systems. Base 60, perhaps like the Sumerians later used, a system that divides easily, that accommodates astronomy and geometry, that allows complex calculations without written algorithms. They develop philosophy because isolation and hardship breed introspection. They ask the questions all humans eventually ask. Why are we here? What is our purpose? What happens when we die? And in the long polar night, when the sun does not rise for months, when the stars will overhead in their eternal dance, they develop answers, cosmologies, theologies, systems of meaning that will echo down through the millennia, carried by their descendants to distant lands. And then the climate changes. The younger Dryas begins, or perhaps an earlier cold snap, one of the many oscillations that characterize the Ice Age. The geothermal heat is no longer enough. The glaciers advance. The rivers freeze. The lake solidifies. The temperature drops not gradually, but suddenly, catastrophically. Within a generation, perhaps within a decade, the valley becomes uninhabitable. The people have no choice. They must leave or die, so they leave. They take what they can carry, knowledge, memory, a few precious artifacts. They travel north, across the ice, across the treacherous seas, to continents that are warmer but also more crowded, more chaotic, more fragmented. They arrive as refugees, as strangers, as people with advanced knowledge but no homeland. Some integrate into existing populations. Some establish new settlements. Some are remembered as gods, as civilizers, as the ones who brought fire and writing and law. And some are forgotten entirely, their origins lost, their story dissolved into myth. But the capital remains, frozen, waiting, a city under the ice, perfectly preserved, its streets and plazas buried under 2 miles of accumulated snow compressed into solid ice over 12,000 years. If you could tunnel down through that ice, if you could reach the bedrock and walk its ancient paths, what would you find? Tablets inscribed with a language older than Sumerian? Astronomical observatories aligned to stars that have since shifted position due to precession? Art depicting animals that no longer exist, or perhaps never existed outside that isolated valley. Tools and technologies that we would struggle to understand, not because they are advanced in the way we think of advancement, but because they are adapted to a world we no longer inhabit. This is not fantasy. This is possibility. We live in an age where we can map the seafloor in exquisite detail, where we can detect exoplanets thousands of light years away, where we can sequence the genome of a Neanderthal from a 50,000-year-old tooth fragment. But we cannot excavate Antarctica. The ice is too thick, the environment too hostile, the political complexities too entangled. The Antarctic Treaty prohibits commercial exploitation and restricts scientific activity to minimize environmental impact. There are good reasons for this. But one consequence is that the continent remains largely unexplored at ground level. We know more about the surface of Mars than we do about what lies beneath the Antarctic ice. And yet, we have glimpses, radar anomalies, gravitational irregularities, magnetic signatures that do not match the expected geology, geothermal hotspots in unexpected locations, ancient maps that should not exist, pyramidal formations that may be mountains or may not. All of these are pieces of a puzzle we are only beginning to see. There is a concept in archaeology called horizons, periods when a particular cultural trait or technology spreads rapidly across multiple regions, appearing almost simultaneously in places that should have no contact with one another. The origins of these horizons are often mysterious. How did the same pottery styles appear in both China and the Mediterranean in the same century? How did agricultural techniques spread so quickly across continents? The usual explanation is diffusion, trade routes, migration, cultural exchange. But what if some horizons are not diffusion but memory? What if they represent not the spread of a new idea, but the reemergence of an old one, carried by people who were trying to recreate what they had lost? The post-Younger Dryas horizon is one of the most dramatic in human history. Within a few thousand years after the Ice Age ends, we see the sudden rise of agriculture in at least 7 independent locations around the world. the Fertile Crescent, the Indus Valley, China, Sub-Saharan Africa, Mesoamerica, the Andes, and New Guinea. In each case, the transition is swift. Hunter-gatherer societies become farming societies within a few generations. Crops are domesticated, animals are tamed, villages grow into towns. It is as if humanity suddenly remembered how to do this, as if the knowledge was latent, waiting for the right conditions to reemerge. What if it was? What if agriculture was not invented independently 7 times, but remembered once, then applied in 7 different environments by people who carried the knowledge from a common source? What if that source was Antarctica, and the people who fled it brought with them not seeds? Those would not survive the journey, nor the climate, but the concept, the process, the understanding that food can be cultivated, controlled, made reliable. They would adapt it to local conditions, to local plants and animals, creating the appearance of independent invention. But the underlying principle, the leap from foraging to farming, would be a memory, not a discovery. Consider language. The linguistic diversity of the world is staggering, yet all human languages share certain deep structures: grammar, syntax, recursion. Linguists debate whether this universality is biological, hardwired into our brains, or cultural, inherited from a common ancestral language. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps there was a proto-language spoken by a population large and stable enough to develop linguistic complexity, and perhaps that language was spoken in Antarctica before the freeze. When the population scattered, they carried that linguistic foundation with them, and over millennia, it diversified into the thousands of languages we know today. But the root, the core, the deep grammar, that remains a fossil embedded in every tongue. Genetic studies tell us that all modern humans outside Africa descend from a small population that migrated roughly 70,000 years ago. But there are also strange genetic markers, anomalies that suggest intermixing with other populations, or bottlenecks that reduced human diversity at various points. One such bottleneck appears to have occurred around 12,000 years ago, coinciding with the Younger Dryas. Populations crashed. Genetic diversity narrowed. Something catastrophic happened. What if part of that catastrophe was the loss of the Antarctic population? A group that may have been genetically distinct, adapted to high-latitude life, and whose loss removed an entire branch from the human family tree. We know that humans are capable of extraordinary adaptation. The Inuit thrive in the Arctic. The Sherpa live at altitudes that would kill most people. The Bijou of Southeast Asia can hold their breath for 10 minutes while diving. These are not genetic accidents. They are the result of thousands of years of natural selection in specific environments. If humans lived in Antarctica for even a few thousand years, they would have adapted. Larger lung capacity, perhaps, to extract more oxygen from cold air. Increased fat deposits for insulation. Enhanced cold tolerance. If such a population existed, and if they were forced to migrate to warmer climates, their descendants would carry those adaptations, diluted over generations but present nonetheless. Do we see such markers in any modern populations? We might if we knew what to look for. Antarctica is also unique in its magnetic properties. The South Magnetic Pole is not fixed. It wanders, shifting position over time in response to changes in the Earth's magnetic field. But the continent itself is situated over a region of unusual magnetic intensity, likely due to the composition of the underlying bedrock. Ancient peoples were often sensitive to magnetic anomalies, constructing sacred sites at locations where the Earth's magnetic field was strongest or most unusual. Stonehenge, the Great Pyramid, Machu Picchu, all are located at geomagnetic hotspots. If Antarctica was inhabited, its magnetic properties would not have gone unnoticed. They might have been central to its spiritual significance, its identity as a sacred place, the axis mundi, the center of the world. Imagine the mythology that would arise from such a place. A land at the bottom of the world, where the stars circle endlessly, where the sun vanishes for months at a time, where the ground itself hums with magnetic energy. A land of cold and darkness, but also of clarity and power. The gods would be born there in the stories. The first humans would emerge from its ice. The great flood would be the ice itself, advancing, drowning the old world in frozen waves. And when the people fled, they would carry those myths with them, retelling them in new lands, under new skies, until the original setting was forgotten and only the story remained. This is how memory works. It is not a photograph, fixed and unchanging. It is a story, retold and reshaped with each generation. Details blur. Geography shifts. Names change. But the core remains the emotional truth, the sense that once, long ago, we came from somewhere else, somewhere lost, somewhere we can never return to. Let us turn to the physical evidence in more detail. The Gamburtsev mountain range, located in the interior of East Antarctica, was discovered only recently, hidden beneath more than 2 miles of ice. It is a range comparable in size to the Alps, with peaks rising over 9,000 feet above the bedrock. Seismic surveys reveal that these mountains are not young volcanic formations but ancient, part of the original Antarctic landmass. They have been buried by ice for millions of years. But here is the crucial detail. The mountains are not smooth, not eroded into gentle slopes as you would expect from such long burial. They are sharp, rugged, deeply carved by river valleys and gorges. This suggests that they were shaped relatively recently, in geological terms, by flowing water and active erosion. The rivers that carved them existed after the initial ice sheet formed, meaning there were periods when the ice retreated, when the climate warmed enough for water to flow, for erosion to occur. If this is true, then Antarctica has not been continuously frozen for 34 million years. There have been warm intervals, perhaps many of them, during which the land was at least partially ice-free. One such interval may have been as recent as 3 to 5 million years ago. Another may have coincided with the Eemian interglacial, roughly 130,000 years ago, when global temperatures were warmer than today and ice sheets retreated worldwide. During the Eemian, sea levels were 15 to 20 feet higher than present. Coastlines expanded. Forests grew in regions that are tundra today. If Antarctica experienced similar warming, large portions of its coast could have been habitable. Not tropical, not temperate in the way we think of it, but livable, capable of supporting vegetation and the animals that depend on it. Now consider the implications if humans existed during the Eemian. Anatomically, modern humans were already present in Africa. They were exploring, migrating, adapting to new environments. Is it so impossible to imagine that some of them, over tens of thousands of years, made their way south, following coastlines, island hopping, eventually reaching the Antarctic Peninsula? The distance from the southern tip of South America to the Antarctic Peninsula is less than 600 miles. With watercraft, even primitive ones, that distance is crossable. The Polynesians crossed thousands of miles of open ocean with outrigger canoes. Why could early humans not cross the Drake Passage during a warm interval when sea ice was minimal? If they did, and if they established a presence on the Antarctic coast, they would have had over 100,000 years to develop, to adapt, to build. 100,000 years is a long time. It is twice as long as the entirety of recorded human history. Civilizations could rise and fall multiple times within such a span. And if, at the end of the Eemian, the climate turned cold again, as it inevitably did, those people would have faced a choice: adapt to the encroaching ice or leave. Some may have stayed, clinging to geothermal refugia, becoming progressively more isolated as the ice locked them in. Others would have fled north, carrying their knowledge, their culture, their memory of a homeland now vanishing beneath the glaciers. This is speculative, yes, but it is not baseless. The genetic, climatic, and geological evidence all point to the possibility. And the absence of direct archaeological evidence is not a refutation, it is a consequence of ice. You cannot find what you cannot excavate. And Antarctica remains, for the most part, unexcavated. There is another piece of evidence that deserves attention: the Piri-Reis map, which we mentioned earlier, and its companion, the Orontius Phineas map of 1531. The Orontius Phineas map shows the entire Antarctic continent, not as a single ice mass, but as a landmass with rivers, mountains, and an ice-free interior. The level of cartographic sophistication is remarkable for the 16th century. These maps were not based on contemporary exploration. No European had reached Antarctica yet. They were, according to their creators, compilations of older maps, sourced from the libraries of Alexandria and Constantinople, places where ancient knowledge was preserved. If true, this means that someone, at some point in the distant past, mapped Antarctica when it was not entirely covered by ice. Who were they? When did they do it? And how did their maps survive long enough to be copied by Renaissance cartographers? Skeptics argue that these maps are misinterpretations, that the landmasses depicted are actually South America or other known continents, distorted by primitive cartographic techniques. But the counterargument is compelling. The Orontius Phineas map shows the correct general shape of Antarctica, including bays and inlets that were not verified until satellite imaging in the 20th century. It shows the transantarctic mountain range in approximately the correct location. It shows a coastline that matches the subglacial bedrock topography, not the current ice-covered coast. If this is coincidence, it is a remarkable one. Moreover, the existence of such maps aligns with other anomalies in ancient cartography. The Ptolemaic maps of the 2nd century CE show the Indian Ocean as a closed sea, with a southern landmass, Terra Australis, connecting Africa to Asia. This was not speculation. Ptolemy was compiling older sources, navigational records from seafarers who had explored those waters. If those seafarers had reached Antarctica, or had inherited maps from those who did, then a southern landmass would have been a known, if distant, reality. We are left, then, with a pattern. Ancient maps that show Antarctica. Ancient myths that describe a southern homeland. Geological evidence of periodic warming. Radar images of subglacial formations that resemble structures. Genetic bottlenecks coinciding with climate catastrophes. Astronomical knowledge in early civilizations that suggests observation from high southern latitudes. Each piece of evidence is individually inconclusive, but together they form a picture, faint and incomplete, but undeniably there. A picture of a continent that was once habitable, perhaps recently enough for humans to have been there, and that was subsequently buried beneath ice so thoroughly that all direct evidence vanished. What would it mean if Antarctica was the first capital of humanity? Not the birthplace, that honor likely belongs to Africa, but the first true capital, the first place where a large, stable population gathered, built, and created something recognizable as civilization. It would mean rewriting human history. It would mean acknowledging that our timeline is incomplete, that the story we tell about our past is only the most recent chapter of a much longer book. It would mean accepting that humanity has risen and fallen before, that knowledge has been lost and recovered, that we are not the first to ask these questions, to build these structures, to reach for understanding. There is a certain humility in this idea, and a certain terror. Humility, because it reminds us that we are not the pinnacle of human achievement, not the culmination of a linear progression toward enlightenment. We are one iteration among many, standing on foundations we did not lay, using tools we did not invent, remembering ideas that were old before recorded history began. And terror, because if civilizations have been lost before, so completely that only ice and myth preserve their memory, then we too can be lost. Our cities, our knowledge, our entire world could be buried, forgotten, reduced to anomalies that future archaeologists will debate and dismiss. But there is also wonder. If Antarctica holds the ruins of the first human capital, then it is the greatest archaeological site on Earth, still pristine, still untouched, waiting beneath the ice for the day when we develop the technology and the will to reach it. Imagine what we might find. Libraries carved into stone, records of languages we have never heard, star maps showing constellations as they appeared 15,000 years ago, before the precession of the equinoxes shifted the heavens. Art depicting daily life, mythology, cosmology. Tools and technologies adapted to an environment we can barely survive in today. And perhaps most importantly, answers. Answers to the questions that haunt us. Where do we come from? How did we become what we are? What knowledge have we lost, and can we recover it? The ice is melting, not quickly but measurably. Climate change is revealing parts of Antarctica that have been hidden for millennia. Glaciers are retreating. Subglacial lakes are being drilled. Satellites are mapping the bedrock with unprecedented precision. Every year we see a little more. And with each new discovery, the picture becomes clearer. We are not looking at a lifeless continent. We are looking at a time capsule, sealed by ice, preserved by cold, waiting for us to open it. But we must be cautious. Antarctica is fragile. Its ecosystems, though minimal, are unique and irreplaceable. Its ice holds records of Earth's climate stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, trapped in layers of snow compressed into ice. Each layer a year, each bubble of air a snapshot of the ancient atmosphere. Drilling into that ice, disturbing the subglacial lakes, excavating the bedrock. All of these carry risks. We could contaminate environments that have been isolated for millions of years. We could destroy evidence in our eagerness to find it. The Antarctic Treaty exists to prevent this, to ensure that the continent remains a place of science, not exploitation. But the treaty is not permanent, can be renegotiated, reinterpreted, abandoned. And as resources become scarce, as climate change accelerates, as geopolitical tensions rise, the temptation to exploit Antarctica will grow. If we are to explore Antarctica responsibly, we must do so with the understanding that we are not conquerors, not colonizers, but students. We are seeking to learn, not to extract. We are asking questions that may not have easy answers, that may challenge everything we think we know. And we must be prepared for the possibility that what we find will not fit neatly into our existing narratives, that it will be strange, unsettling, paradigm-shattering. Consider the implications for religion, for philosophy, for our sense of identity. If we discover that humanity once built a civilization in Antarctica, that it thrived there for thousands of years, and that it was destroyed by climate change, then we are forced to confront the cyclical nature of our existence. We are not ascending toward some ultimate destiny. We are rising and falling, building and losing, remembering and forgetting. The gods we worship, the histories we revere, the knowledge we prize. All of it may be fragments of something older, echoes of voices that spoke in a language we no longer understand, in a place we have erased from memory. And yet, there is hope in this, because if we have risen before, we can rise again. If knowledge was lost, it can be relearned. If Antarctica was once a capital of human achievement, then the ice that covers it is not an ending but a pause, a long silence that will one day be broken. We are the descendants of those who fled the ice. We carry their memory in our genes, in our myths, in the way we look at the stars and wonder. And perhaps one day we will return, not as refugees but as explorers, seeking to understand the place that made us. What if the oldest city on Earth is not lost, but waiting? What if the first capital of humanity is not a ruin to be mourned, but a promise to be fulfilled? What if, beneath 2 miles of ice, in the silence and darkness, there is a message, carved into stone or encoded in symbols, left by people who knew that the ice was coming, who knew that their world was ending, but who believed that one day, someone would return and read what they had written. That message would not be in words we recognize. It would be in the structures themselves, in the alignments and proportions, in the choice of location and orientation. It would say, we were here. We built this. We knew the stars and the seasons. We asked the same questions you are asking. We do not have all the answers, but we tried. And if you have found this, then you are like us. You are seekers. You are survivors. You are human. The silence of Antarctica is not empty. It is full of compressed time, of frozen memory, of secrets that have waited longer than empires, longer than religions, longer than any language still spoken. When you stand on the ice, you are standing on history itself, layered and compacted, 12,000 years deep in some places, 100,000 in others. Every snowflake that fell is still there, transformed into crystal, locked into place, holding within it a molecule of the air that existed the day it fell. If you could read that ice layer by layer, you could reconstruct the climate of the entire Holocene, the entire last ice age, and beyond. You could know what the Earth was like before we changed it. You could know what it might become again. But ice is not the only archive in Antarctica. Beneath it lies rock, ancient and unyielding, rock that was once part of Gondwana, the supercontinent that included Africa, South America, Australia, India. Antarctica is the keystone of that ancient landmass, the piece that connected all the others. When Gondwana broke apart, roughly 180 million years ago, Antarctica drifted south, carrying with it the memory of a world that no longer exists. Fossils have been found there. Ferns, trees, dinosaurs, all remnants of a time when the continent was warm and green. If life thrived there once, why not again? Why not during the brief warm intervals of the Ice Age, when the glaciers retreated and rivers flowed and the air was soft enough to breathe without pain? We speak of Antarctica as if it were always frozen, always dead, but that is a failure of imagination. The continent has existed for hundreds of millions of years. Ice has covered it for only a fraction of that time. For most of its existence, Antarctica was alive. And even during the Ice Age, it was not uniformly frozen. There were refugia, pockets of habitability, isolated valleys, geothermal springs. Life found a way, as it always does. Microorganisms survive in subglacial lakes, thriving in darkness and cold that would kill most organisms instantly. They have been isolated for millions of years, evolving independently, creating ecosystems that exist nowhere else on Earth. If microorganisms can survive beneath the ice, what else might have? The idea of a subglacial ecosystem is not science fiction. Lake Vostok, buried beneath more than 2 miles of ice, has been isolated from the surface for at least 15 million years, possibly much longer. When Russian scientists finally drilled through the ice to reach the lake in 2012, they found it teeming with microbial life. Thousands of species, many unknown to science, all thriving in an environment that should have been sterile. The lake is not warm, it remains liquid only because of the immense pressure of the ice above it. But it is not frozen, and where there is liquid water, there is the possibility of life. What if there are other lakes, other refugia where more complex life survived? What if there are ecosystems beneath the ice that have been cut off from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years, evolving in isolation, adapting to conditions we can barely imagine? And what if, during the last interglacial, when the ice retreated, humans discovered these places, settled near them, built their shelters and their cities around the warmth that rose from the depths of the earth? This is not wild speculation. Geothermal heat is common in Antarctica. The continent sits atop a region of intense volcanic activity. Mount Erebus, one of the most active volcanoes on Earth, has been erupting continuously for decades. There are dozens of other volcanoes, some dormant, some active, all contributing heat to the bedrock below the ice. Where there is geothermal heat, there is liquid water. Where there is liquid water, there is the possibility of life. And where there is life, there is the possibility of human habitation. Imagine a settlement built around a geothermal spring, where the water emerges hot enough to melt ice, to warm shelters, to sustain a small population through the long polar winter. The people would not need to migrate. They could stay, year-round, harvesting fish from the meltwater lake, hunting seals and birds along the coast, gathering mosses and lichens from the rocks. They would be isolated, yes, but isolation breeds innovation. Without contact with other groups, without the ability to trade or borrow, they would have to invent everything themselves. And in doing so, they might invent things we have not yet imagined, solutions to problems we have never faced, technologies adapted to an environment we cannot survive in without machines. Such a civilization would leave traces, but those traces would be buried under ice, invisible to us until we develop the ability to excavate beneath it. And even then, we might not recognize what we find. We are trained to look for certain markers of civilization, pottery, metal tools, agricultural implements. But a civilization adapted to Antarctica would not use those things. They would use ice, stone, bone, materials that do not decay, that remain functional in extreme cold. Their architecture would be different, their tools different, their entire material culture different from anything we have seen before. We might excavate their city and not realize what we are looking at, because it would not fit our preconceptions of what a city should be. This is the danger of archaeology. We find what we expect to find. We interpret the past through the lens of the present. If we expect Antarctica to be lifeless, we will see lifelessness, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. If we expect human civilization to have arisen only in warm, temperate regions, we will dismiss any evidence to the contrary as anomaly, as misinterpretation, as wishful thinking. But what if the anomalies are not errors? What if they are clues, pointing us toward a truth we are not yet ready to accept? There is a phrase that appears in many ancient texts, from many different cultures, separated by oceans and millennia. The time before the flood. It is always spoken of with reverence, sometimes with longing, as a time when the world was different, when the gods walked among men, when knowledge was abundant and life was long. The phrase is so common, so universal, that we have stopped questioning it. We assume it is metaphor, mythology, a poetic way of describing a distant, idealized past that never existed. But what if it is not metaphor? What if the time before the flood is a literal memory, passed down through generations, of a world that was drowned when the ice melted and the seas rose? The end of the last ice age was not a gentle transition. It was catastrophic. Between roughly 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, global sea levels rose by more than 400 feet. Coastlines that had been stable for tens of thousands of years were inundated. River valleys flooded. Islands vanished. Entire ecosystems were drowned, and with them any settlements that had been built along the coasts. Most of the human population at that time would have lived near water, rivers, lakes, coastlines, because water is essential for survival. When the seas rose, those populations were displaced, forced to migrate inland, to higher ground, to places already occupied by other groups. The result would have been chaos. Conflict, resource scarcity, the collapse of established ways of life. But before the flood, before the ice melted, the world was different. Sea levels were lower. Coastlines extended far beyond their current positions. The continental shelves, now submerged, were dry land, vast plains where people lived and hunted and built. The land bridge across the Bering Strait connected Asia and North America. The islands of Southeast Asia were connected into a single landmass called Sunda. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The Black Sea was a freshwater lake. And Antarctica, perhaps, was not entirely frozen. Its coastlines extended further. Its interior held pockets of habitability. Its geothermal valleys were warm enough to sustain life. If humanity had established settlements in these places, if we had built cities along the coasts of the continental shelves, if we had developed agriculture and astronomy and written language in the time before the flood, then all of that would now be underwater or under ice, invisible to us, inaccessible. We would know nothing of it except what survived in myth, in fragments of inherited knowledge, in the faint echoes of memory that persisted through the catastrophe. This is why the flood myths are so important. They are not just stories. They are data. They are records of a global event that traumatized humanity so profoundly that every culture, no matter how isolated, preserved some version of it. And they all describe the same thing: a sudden, overwhelming rise in water levels, the loss of the old world, the survival of only a few, the need to rebuild from scratch. If we take these myths seriously, if we treat them as oral history rather than fiction, then we are forced to reconsider what we know about the development of civilization. What if the great civilizations of the post-flood world, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, were not the first but the latest? What if they were founded by survivors, by refugees from the drowned coastlands, by people who carried with them the knowledge of a previous world? This would explain their sudden appearance, their lack of a clear developmental prehistory, their possession of advanced knowledge that seems to come from nowhere. They were not inventing civilization. They were restoring it. Antarctica fits into this narrative perfectly. If a population had been living there, sustained by geothermal warmth, isolated but thriving, they would have been among the first to be affected by the changing climate. As the Ice Age ended, as temperatures rose globally, the ice sheets that had been stable for millennia began to destabilize. Glaciers that had surrounded their settlements began to advance, not retreat, because the warming climate meant more snowfall, more accumulation, more ice. Paradoxically, the warming made Antarctica less habitable, not more. The geothermal valleys that had sheltered them were flooded by meltwater, then buried by advancing ice. Within a few generations, the land became uninhabitable. The people had to leave. Where did they go? North. Across the Southern Ocean, to South America, to Africa, to Australia. They would have been skilled navigators, because surviving in Antarctica would require an understanding of ice, of currents, of weather patterns. They would have had boats, probably sophisticated ones, because even in isolation, a coastal population develops maritime technology. They would have reached the northern continents and found them populated, but sparsely, because the Ice Age had kept human numbers low. They would have integrated, shared their knowledge, influenced the cultures they encountered. And over time, their origins would be forgotten. The descendants of the Antarctic refugees would not remember the frozen land they came from. They would remember only the flood, the loss, the migration, the struggle to rebuild. This is how history is lost. Not through malice, not through deliberate erasure, but through time, through generational forgetting, through the slow dissolution of memory into myth. We remember the event, the flood, but we forget the context. We remember the migration, but we forget the starting point. We remember that once, long ago, things were different, but we lose the details, and eventually we lose the certainty that it ever happened at all. But the ice remembers. The ice holds everything. Every settlement, every structure, every artifact, every body, perfectly preserved, frozen in time. If we could reach it, if we could excavate beneath the ice with the care and precision that such a task demands, we could recover what was lost. We could read the history that the ice has been keeping for us, patiently, silently, for 12,000 years or more. The question, then, is not whether we should explore Antarctica, but how. The technology exists. Ice-penetrating radar can map the bedrock. Ground-penetrating sonar can detect voids and structures. Remote-operated vehicles can navigate subglacial lakes. Drilling equipment can reach depths of several miles. We have the tools. What we lack is the will, the funding, and perhaps the courage to confront what we might find. Because if we discover evidence of a pre-Ice Age civilization in Antarctica, the implications are staggering. It would mean that human history is far older and far more complex than we have imagined. It would mean that the timeline we teach in schools, the narrative we accept as fact, is incomplete at best, wrong at worst. It would raise uncomfortable questions about what else we have missed, what other evidence lies buried or dismissed or ignored because it does not fit the paradigm. The scientific establishment is conservative by nature, and for good reason. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But conservatism can become rigidity. Paradigms can become prisons. When evidence is dismissed not because it is insufficient, but because it is inconvenient, because it challenges too much, because it would require too many textbooks to be rewritten, then we are no longer doing science. We are defending a worldview. Antarctica is the ultimate test of our openness to new ideas. It is the one place on Earth where our assumptions have not been tested, because we have not been able to test them. It is a blank space on the map, not because nothing is there, but because we have not looked. And the longer we wait, the more we risk. Climate change is melting the ice. The subglacial lakes are becoming less isolated. The bedrock is being exposed in places. If there are artifacts there, if there are structures, they are vulnerable now in a way they have not been for millennia. They could be damaged, eroded, lost forever, before we even know they exist. We need to act, but we need to act responsibly. This is not a treasure hunt. This is not a race to claim discovery for national pride or academic prestige. This is a sacred task, a responsibility we owe to our ancestors and our descendants alike. If Antarctica was the first capital of humanity, then it is the birthplace of everything we are. It deserves reverence, patience, and the highest level of scientific rigor. Imagine the moment when the first excavation breaks through the ice and reaches the bedrock below. Imagine the cameras descending into the darkness, into spaces that have not seen light for 12,000 years. Imagine what they might find. A wall, perhaps, carved with symbols. A tool shaped by human hands. A structure, unmistakably artificial, undeniably ancient. That moment will change everything. It will be the moment when human history splits into before and after, when we stop thinking of ourselves as the culmination of a linear progression and start seeing ourselves as part of a cycle, one iteration among many. But even if we find nothing, even if the ice yields only rock and silence, the search itself is valuable. Because the act of looking, the willingness to question, the courage to explore, that is what makes us human. We are not content with the known. We are driven to seek the unknown, to push beyond the boundaries of our understanding, to ask the questions that have no easy answers. This is what our ancestors did, whoever they were, wherever they came from. They looked at the horizon and wondered what lay beyond. They looked at the stars and wondered what they were. They looked at themselves and wondered why they were here. We are doing the same. We are looking at Antarctica, at the ice that covers it, and we are wondering what lies beneath. We are asking if the conventional timeline is complete, if the accepted narrative is accurate, if there is more to our history than we have been told. These are not idle questions. They are fundamental questions, questions that touch on identity, on purpose, on the very nature of what it means to be human. And perhaps, in the end, that is the real reason we should explore Antarctica. Not to find a lost civilization, though that would be extraordinary. Not to rewrite history, though that may be necessary. But to remind ourselves that we do not know everything, that there are still mysteries, still frontiers, still places where the known world ends and the unknown begins. In an age where we can map every inch of the Earth's surface from space, where we can sequence genomes and simulate universes and predict the weather weeks in advance, it is easy to believe that we have figured it all out, that there are no more secrets. But Antarctica reminds us that this is not true. There are secrets still, vast and profound, hidden beneath the ice, waiting. What if Antarctica was the first capital of humanity? What if the oldest city on Earth is not a ruin open to the sky, not a tumble of stones weathered by time, but a frozen archive, perfectly preserved, waiting in darkness for the day we are ready to receive it? What if everything we think we know about our origins is only the most recent chapter of a much longer story? A story that begins not in the river valleys of the Near East, but at the bottom of the world, in a place so cold and so silent that memory itself has frozen there. That is the question this exploration has asked. Not to provide answers because the answers are still buried, still waiting, but to open the possibility, to create space for doubt, for wonder, for the recognition that our history is not settled, not complete. There is more to learn. There is more to discover. And Antarctica, silent and patient, holds it all. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What hemisphere holds you as we contemplate the one that may hold our deepest secrets? If this journey has moved you, if it has opened questions you did not know you had, let the algorithm know. Share this with those who wonder, who question, who are not satisfied with easy answers. We are all seekers. We are all descendants of those who looked beyond the horizon. And Antarctica is the ultimate horizon, the final frontier of our own past. The wind in Antarctica does not behave like wind elsewhere. It does not gust and fade. It is constant, relentless, a physical presence that grinds against the ice, against the rock, against anything that dares to exist there. It is called a katabatic wind, a gravity-driven flow of cold air that pours down from the high interior plateau toward the coast, accelerating as it descends, reaching speeds that can exceed 200 miles per hour. It is the breath of the continent, ancient and cold, carrying with it the scent of ice that has not melted in millennia. To stand in that wind is to feel the weight of time, the indifference of nature, the smallness of human presence. But beneath that wind, beneath the ice, there is stillness. Absolute, perfect stillness. No wind penetrates the ice. No sound. No light. Just the slow, patient pressure of millions of tons of frozen water, pressing down, compressing the layers below, turning snow into ice, ice into crystal, crystal into something harder and clearer than anything we can manufacture. In that stillness, time moves differently. 1,000 years is a moment. 1,000,000 years is a breath. The ice does not care. It simply exists, layer upon layer, holding within itself the history of the world. If there is a city beneath that ice, it exists in that stillness. The streets are silent. His buildings stand empty. His people are gone, fled or dead. Their bones perhaps still there, frozen in place, waiting. What did they think, those last inhabitants, as they watched the ice advance, as they realized that their home, their city, their entire world was being buried? Did they hope that someone would return, that the ice would retreat, that their story would be remembered? Or did they accept the inevitable, the cold logic of geology and climate, the understanding that all things end? We do not know. We cannot know, not yet. But we can imagine. And in imagining, we honor them. We give them a voice, however speculative, however uncertain. We say, you existed, you mattered, you were human like us, and even if your city is lost, even if your names are forgotten, even if nothing remains but frozen stone beneath 2 miles of ice, you are not erased. We remember, or we try to. This is the power of history, of archaeology, of the relentless human need to understand where we came from. It is not just about facts and dates and artifacts. It is about connection. It is about recognizing that we are part of a continuity, a long chain of existence that stretches back further than we can see and forward further than we can imagine. Every generation believes it is unique, that it is facing challenges no one has faced before, that it is inventing solutions that are entirely new. But the truth is simpler and more humbling. We are repeating patterns, walking paths that others have walked, asking questions that others have asked. The details change. The technology evolves. But the core remains the same. We are human and we seek to understand. If Antarctica was the first capital, then the people who lived there were like us. They wondered about the stars. They told stories to their children. They built shelters against the cold. They felt love, fear, hope, despair. They looked at the ice advancing and made impossible choices. Some stayed. Some left. Some survived. Some did not. But all of them were human, and that humanity connects us across the gulf of time. We are their descendants, perhaps not genetically, perhaps not culturally, but certainly spiritually. We are the ones who are still asking questions, still seeking, still refusing to accept that the past is settled. And this brings us to the final, most profound implication of the Antarctic hypothesis. If humanity has risen and fallen before, if civilizations have been built and buried, if knowledge has been lost and painfully recovered, then we are not guaranteed survival. We are not exempt from the forces that destroyed those who came before us. Climate change, resource depletion, conflict, catastrophe, these are not new threats. They are ancient threats as old as humanity itself. Our ancestors faced them. Some survived. Some did not. We like to believe that we are different, that our technology, our knowledge, our sophistication will protect us. But Antarctica reminds us that the Earth does not care. The ice does not care. Time does not care. If the conditions change, if the climate shifts, if the delicate balance that sustains us is disrupted, we too can be buried, forgotten, reduced to anomalies that future archaeologists will struggle to interpret. This is not pessimism. It is realism. It is the recognition that we are part of nature, not separate from it, not above it. We are subject to the same forces that shaped the past, and those forces are still active. The ice is still advancing in some places, still retreating in others. The seas are still rising. The climate is still changing. And we, like our ancestors, must adapt or perish. But there is hope in this recognition, because if we have survived before, we can survive again. If knowledge was lost and recovered, it can be preserved. If Antarctica holds the ruins of the first capital, then it also holds lessons, warnings, perhaps even instructions. Not in words, perhaps, but in the very fact of its existence. Says, we were here, we built, we thrived for a time, and then the world changed. Learn from us. Do not repeat our mistakes. Remember us not as failures, but as precursors, as the first attempt, as the foundation upon which you stand. This is why the search for the Antarctic civilization is not just an archaeological curiosity. It is a moral imperative. It is about understanding our place in the long arc of human history, about recognizing that we are not the endpoint, not the culmination, but one moment in a much longer story. And it is about taking responsibility, not just for our own future, but for the memory of those who came before and the potential of those who will come after. There is a particular quality to the light in Antarctica, something that cannot be described but only experienced. Because the ice reflects nearly all the sunlight that hits it, the world is impossibly bright, almost blinding, even on overcast days. But beneath that brightness is a coldness, a sterility, a sense that life is not welcome here. The light is pure, clinical, revealing every detail without warmth or mercy. It is the light of truth, perhaps, but truth without comfort. In the long polar night, when the sun does not rise for months, the quality changes. The darkness is not the soft darkness of temperate latitudes, where starlight and moonlight provide some illumination. It is absolute. The stars are brilliant, the Milky Way a river of light across the sky, but they do not warm, do not comfort. They are distant, indifferent, beautiful in their coldness. To stand beneath those stars, alone on the ice, is to feel the vastness of space, the insignificance of the earth, the fragility of human existence. It is a spiritual experience in its way, but not a comforting one. If the Antarctic civilization existed, they lived under those stars. They experienced that light, that darkness, that overwhelming sense of isolation. How did it shape them? How did it influence their cosmology, their philosophy, their art? A people who lived for generations beneath the southern stars would develop a fundamentally different relationship with the cosmos than those who lived near the equator, where the stars rotate evenly through the year. In Antarctica, the stars circle the south celestial pole, neither rising nor setting, locked in eternal rotation. Polaris, the North Star, is forever below the horizon, invisible, a concept without reality. The sun, in summer, circles the sky without setting, creating an endless day. In winter, it vanishes entirely, creating an endless night. Such extremes would shape consciousness itself. A civilization that developed in Antarctica would not think about time the way we do. They would not measure days and nights as separate, equal units. They would think in seasons, in long cycles of light and dark, in patterns that repeat over months rather than hours. Their calendar would be different, their sense of rhythm different, their entire relationship with the passage of time different. And when they were forced to leave, when they migrated north to lands where the sun rose and set every day, where the stars wheeled overhead in predictable patterns, it would have been disorienting. The world would have felt unstable, chaotic, too fast. They would have carried with them a longing for the long, slow rhythms of the polar world, a memory of a time when light and dark were not fleeting moments but vast, encompassing states of being. Is this why so many ancient cultures obsessed over astronomical cycles? Is this why they built stone circles and pyramids aligned to solstices and equinoxes? Were they trying to recreate, in symbolic form, the experience of living in a place where the cosmos was the dominant reality, where human life was small and fleeting beneath the eternal wheel of the stars? If the first human civilization arose in Antarctica, then astronomy would not have been a luxury, a curiosity for priests and scholars. It would have been essential, a matter of survival, because understanding the rhythms of light and dark, the patterns of the stars, the cycles of the seasons would be the only way to predict when the ice would advance, when the geothermal warmth would fail, when it was time to leave. And so they watched, they measured, they recorded, they carved symbols into stone, not as art, not as religion, but as data, as memory, as a way to preserve knowledge across generations. And when they left, when they scattered to other continents, they carried that obsession with them. They taught their descendants to watch the skies, to mark the solstices, to build monuments aligned to celestial events. Not because it was necessary in their new homes, where the climate was stable and the seasons predictable, but because it was memory. It was identity. It was a connection to a lost world, a way of saying, we came from somewhere else, somewhere older, somewhere that no longer exists except in the patterns we trace across the sky. This is speculation, yes, but it is grounded in what we know about human behavior, about cultural transmission, about the persistence of memory even when the context is lost. We carry our origins with us, whether we know it or not. We repeat patterns established by ancestors we never met, in places we have never been. If those ancestors lived in Antarctica, then the echoes of that life are still with us, embedded in the structures we build, the stories we tell, the questions we ask. What if the obsession with finding Atlantis, with seeking lost civilizations, with believing that there was a golden age in the distant past, is not fantasy but racial memory? What if, on some deep, unconscious level, we know that something was lost, that we came from somewhere we can no longer return to, that our history is incomplete? Atlantis may not be a real place, but the longing for it is real. The sense that humanity once possessed something precious and lost it is real. And if that loss was Antarctica, if the first capital was frozen and forgotten, then the longing makes sense. We are mourning something we do not remember, grieving for a homeland we have never seen. This is the deepest layer of the mystery. Not the physical question of whether a civilization existed in Antarctica, but the psychological question of why we feel so drawn to the idea. Why does it resonate? Why does it feel, on some level, true? Perhaps because it is true. Perhaps because the ice holds not just ruins but memory, not just artifacts but identity, not just history but the origin of who we are. To speak of Antarctica as the first capital is to speak of beginnings, but also of endings. It is to recognize that everything we build is temporary. Everything we know is fragile. Everything we achieve can be taken away by forces beyond our control. The ice does not negotiate. The climate does not compromise. The Earth operates on timescales that dwarf human lifespans, human civilizations, human entire histories. We exist in the blink of an eye, and yet, within that blink, we create meaning, beauty, knowledge. We build cities not because they will last forever, but because we need them now. We tell stories, not because they will survive unchanged, but because they give shape to our experience. We seek to understand our origins, not because the past can be recovered, but because understanding it helps us navigate the present. If Antarctica was the first capital, then it represents both the potential and the limits of human ambition. The potential, because it shows that humans can thrive even in the most hostile environments, that we can adapt, innovate, create stability where none should exist. And the limits, because it shows that even the most stable system can be disrupted, even the most successful adaptation can be overwhelmed, even the greatest city can be buried and forgotten. This is the dual lesson of Antarctica. We are capable of more than we imagine, but we are also more vulnerable than we admit. The modern world is built on the assumption of stability. We assume that the climate will remain roughly as it is, that sea levels will stay where they are, that the systems that sustain us will continue to function. But history, deep history, the kind that lies buried beneath ice and ocean, tells us that this assumption is false. Stability is the exception, not the rule. Change is constant. The Earth is always shifting, always adjusting, always responding to forces both internal and external. We happen to live in a moment of relative calm, a brief interglacial period when the ice has retreated and the climate has stabilized enough for agriculture, for cities, for the technological civilization we take for granted. But this moment will not last forever. The ice will return, or the seas will rise, or some other force we have not anticipated will disrupt the balance. And when that happens, we will face the same choice the Antarctic civilization faced: adapt or leave. This is not a distant, abstract threat. It is already happening. The ice is melting. The seas are rising. The climate is changing faster than at any point in human history, faster than most species can adapt to. We are, in real time, recreating the conditions that ended the last ice age, that drowned the coastal cities, that forced our ancestors to migrate and rebuild. The difference is that this time we are causing it. We are the asteroid, the volcano, the force of nature that is disrupting the balance. And unlike our ancestors, we have the knowledge, the technology, the global coordination to respond. Whether we will use it, whether we will act in time, remains to be seen. Antarctica is a mirror. It shows us what we were, perhaps, and what we might become. If we ignore its lessons, if we dismiss the evidence of past climate catastrophes as irrelevant to the present, then we risk repeating the same mistakes. But if we listen, if we take seriously the idea that humanity has faced existential threats before and survived only by adapting, by moving, by starting over, then we have a chance. Not to prevent change that may no longer be possible, but to manage it, to ensure that when the systems we depend on fail, we have alternatives, we have plans, we have the resilience to rebuild. This is the ultimate value of exploring Antarctica, of seeking the lost civilization that may or may not lie beneath the ice. It is not about satisfying curiosity, though that is important. It is not about rewriting history, though that may be necessary. It is about learning from the past so that we can navigate the future. If we find evidence of a pre-Ice Age civilization, we will learn how they adapted, what they built, how they survived for as long as they did. And we will learn how they failed, what they could not overcome, what ultimately destroyed them. Both lessons are valuable. Both are necessary. And if we find nothing, if the ice yields only silence, that too is a lesson. It tells us that Antarctica has always been hostile, that no one lived there before the ice, that the continent is and always was a frozen wasteland. But even that lesson has value. It reminds us that there are limits, that not every environment can be tamed, that some places are beyond human habitation. It humbles us, and humility is something we desperately need. The search for the Antarctic civilization is, in the end, a search for ourselves. It is an attempt to understand where we came from, how we became what we are, and where we are going. It is a recognition that we are part of a story much larger than any individual life, any single generation, any particular culture or nation. We are part of the human story, a story that stretches back hundreds of thousands of years and will, if we are fortunate and wise, stretch forward for thousands or millions more. Antarctica is one chapter in that story, perhaps the first chapter, perhaps the most important. Or perhaps it is a blank page, waiting for us to write it. Either way, the search matters. The questions matter. The willingness to challenge accepted narratives, to explore uncomfortable possibilities, to admit that we do not know everything, that matters. It is what makes us human. It is what connects us to those who came before and those who will come after. It is what ensures that the story continues, that knowledge is preserved, that memory, however fragmented, survives. So let us continue to ask. Let us continue to explore. Let us continue to wonder. And let us remember that beneath the ice, beneath the silence, beneath 2 miles of frozen history, there may be answers. Or there may be more questions. But either way, the search is worth it. The drilling platforms stand on the ice like monuments to human curiosity, metal towers rising against the white expanse, cables and pipes descending into the depths. They are fragile things, these platforms, vulnerable to the wind and cold, constantly at risk of mechanical failure or storm damage. But they persist because we persist, because the need to know is stronger than the discomfort of not knowing. Every year we drill deeper. Every year we map more of the subglacial topography. Every year we come closer to understanding what lies beneath. But drilling is slow. It is expensive. It is technically challenging in ways that most people do not appreciate. Ice is not uniform. It contains layers of varying density, pockets of air, regions where the crystal structure changes. Drilling through it requires specialized equipment, constant monitoring, adjustments for pressure and temperature. And when you finally reach the bedrock, when the drill bit touches stone after weeks or months of descent, you have only reached one point. One location out of millions of possible locations across the continent. You have not excavated. You have not explored. You have simply touched the surface of what lies below. To truly explore Antarctica, to search for evidence of a lost civilization, we would need a different approach. Not drilling, but imaging. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic surveys, gravitational mapping. These technologies can see through the ice without disturbing it, can create three-dimensional maps of the bedrock, can identify anomalies that might indicate structures, voids, or other features of interest. This is how we have discovered the subglacial lakes, the buried mountain ranges, the ancient river systems. And this is how we might discover cities, if they exist. But even the best imaging technology has limits. Radar can detect large structures but not small ones. It can identify straight lines, right angles, geometric patterns that suggest artificiality, but it cannot tell you what those patterns are. Is it a wall or a rock formation? A street or a natural channel? A building or a collapsed ice cave? To answer those questions, you need direct observation. You need to excavate. And excavation in Antarctica is not just difficult. It is nearly impossible with current technology. The ice is too thick to simply dig through. You cannot shovel your way down 2 miles. You would need to melt it, using hot water or lasers or some other heat source, and melting releases enormous amounts of meltwater, which then refreezes, creating new obstacles. You would need to stabilize the walls of the shaft to prevent collapse. You would need to maintain breathable atmosphere, manageable temperature, constant power supply. It would be the most ambitious excavation in human history, far more complex than deep-sea exploration or space travel, because you are not just visiting a hostile environment, you are trying to dig through it. And yet, it can be done. The technology exists. The challenge is not technical, but economic and political. Who will fund such an endeavor? What nation or organization has the resources and the will to commit to a project that might take decades and cost billions, with no guarantee of results? What if we drill down 2 miles, excavate a promising radar anomaly, and find only rock? What if the formations are natural after all, the product of geological processes we do not fully understand, not evidence of human activity? The risk of failure is high. The potential for embarrassment, for wasted resources, for scientific ridicule is enormous. But so is the potential reward. If we find even a single artifact, a single unambiguous piece of evidence that humans lived in Antarctica before the ice, it changes everything. It proves that the timeline is wrong, that human history is deeper than we thought, that civilization is older than we imagined. It opens the door to reevaluating every assumption we have made about our past. And it raises the stakes for our future, because if we have risen and fallen before, then we need to understand how and why so that we can avoid the same fate. This is why the search must continue. Not recklessly, not carelessly, but methodically, scientifically, with the full weight of international cooperation and the best technology we can bring to bear. Antarctica belongs to no one nation. It is governed by treaty, held in trust for all humanity, for all time. This is as it should be. The continent is too important, too valuable as a scientific resource and a climate archive, to be exploited or claimed. But it is also too important to ignore. We cannot let the difficulty of exploration become an excuse for inaction. We cannot let the fear of failure prevent us from trying. The ice will not wait for us. Climate change is accelerating the melt. Subglacial lakes are becoming less isolated, more vulnerable to contamination. Coastal ice shelves are collapsing, exposing bedrock that has been hidden for millennia. If there is evidence to find, we need to find it now before it is lost, before the warming climate destroys what the cold preserved. Time is not on our side. The window is closing, and so we return to the central question: what if Antarctica was the first capital of humanity? What if, beneath the ice, there is a city waiting, its streets and buildings frozen in time, its people long gone but their legacy intact? What if the knowledge we seek, the answers to our deepest questions about who we are and where we came from, is there, sealed away in the frozen silence, preserved by the very ice that took it from us? We will not know unless we look. And looking requires courage, requires investment, requires a willingness to accept that the world is stranger and older than we have been taught. It requires humility, the recognition that we do not have all the answers, that our understanding of history is provisional, always subject to revision in light of new evidence. And it requires vision, the ability to see beyond the immediate, beyond the comfortable certainties of the present, to the deeper truths that lie hidden beneath the surface. Antarctica is waiting. The ice is patient. The city, if it exists, has waited 12,000 years. Can wait a little longer. But we cannot. We are the generation with the technology, the knowledge, the global perspective to undertake this search. We are the ones who must decide whether to look or to turn away. History will judge us by that choice. There is a moment, late at night, when the mind drifts between waking and sleep, when thoughts become images, images become narratives, and the boundary between memory and imagination dissolves. In that liminal space, it is possible to see things that are not there, or perhaps to see things that are always there but hidden by the noise of daylight consciousness. This is where myth is born, where stories that feel true take root, where the deep past whispers to the present. If you listen in that quiet space, you might hear the wind of Antarctica, not as it sounds today, mechanical, lifeless, the scream of air over ice, but as it sounded then, when it carried the voices of a people who lived there, who called it home, who did not think of it as the end of the world but as the center. You might see the lights of their city, reflected off the ice, warm and steady against the polar night. You might feel the cold, but also the warmth of fire, of shelter, of community. You might sense the enormity of their achievement, to have built a life in such a place, to have thrived where survival alone should have been impossible. And you might feel their fear as the ice advanced. Not quickly, but inexorably, closing in year by year, decade by decade, century by century. The glaciers moving, grinding, reshaping the land. The geothermal warmth failing, or being buried under the weight of ice too thick for heat to penetrate. The realization, slow and terrible, that this could not last, that the world was changing, that they had to leave or die. The arguments, the denial, the acceptance, the preparations, the packing, the final look back at a city that would never be seen again. This is what the ice holds. Not just stones and artifacts, but the emotional weight of an ending. Every abandoned city carries this weight. Pompeii, buried by volcanic ash. Angkor Wat, reclaimed by jungle. Detroit, hollowed out by economic collapse. But those cities were not buried completely. They left traces, memories, the ability for future generations to visit, to walk their streets, to imagine what they were. Antarctica left nothing. It was erased so thoroughly that even the memory of it faded, leaving only a vague sense of loss, a story of a flood that destroyed the world, a nostalgia for a time before, when things were different, when the gods walked among men, when knowledge was whole and not fragmented. If we find the city, if we excavate it, if we bring its artifacts to the surface and study them under laboratory lights, we will be recovering more than history. We will be recovering memory, not just the memory of a civilization, but the memory of humanity's first great success and first great failure. We will be confronting the truth that we are not invincible, that our cities are not eternal, that everything we build is temporary. This is a hard truth, one that our culture resists. We like to believe in progress, in the forward march of civilization, in the idea that each generation builds on the last, that knowledge accumulates, that we are always improving. But the Antarctic hypothesis challenges this. It suggests that progress is not linear but cyclical, that knowledge can be lost as well as gained, that civilizations rise and fall and rise again. This is not a new idea. The Greeks believed in cycles, in ages of gold and silver and bronze and iron, each declining from the last until the gods reset the world and the cycle began again. The Hindus believe in yugas, vast cycles of creation and destruction spanning millions of years. The Maya tracked cycles within cycles, their calendar a nested series of epochs, each ending in transformation or catastrophe. These are not primitive superstitions. They are sophisticated philosophical frameworks, attempts to make sense of the patterns of history, the observation that empires fall, knowledge is lost, darkness follows light, and yet life continues. If Antarctica was the first capital, then these cyclical cosmologies are not metaphor but memory, distorted by time but rooted in truth. What does this mean for us, for the present, for the civilization we are building now? It means we should not take stability for granted. It means we should preserve knowledge not just in books and databases, but in forms that can survive catastrophe, stone monuments, genetic memory, oral traditions, symbols that transcend language. It means we should plan not just for growth but for collapse, for the possibility that what we build will not last, that future generations may need to start over with only fragments of what we knew. This is not pessimism. This is wisdom. And it means we should look to Antarctica not just as a mystery to solve, but as a teacher. If the ice holds the ruins of a civilization, it also holds lessons. How did they live in such a harsh environment? What technologies did they develop? What social structures, what belief systems, what forms of governance allowed them to thrive? And when the end came, how did they respond? Did they fight it, deny it, accept it? Did they leave records, warnings, messages for those who might come after? If we can answer these questions, we gain not just historical knowledge but practical wisdom, tools for navigating our own uncertain future. The search for the Antarctic civilization is ultimately a search for resilience. It is about understanding how humanity has survived in the past, so that we can survive in the future. It is about recognizing that we are part of a long chain of existence, that others have faced what we are facing, and that their experiences, however distant, however fragmentary, can guide us. We are not the first to confront climate change, resource scarcity, the prospect of losing everything we have built. Our ancestors did it. They survived. And if we can learn from them, if we can recover even a fraction of their knowledge, we increase our own chances of survival. This is the deepest reason to explore Antarctica. Not for glory, not for discovery, not even for truth, but for survival. Because the ice is melting, the world is changing, and we need all the wisdom we can find. Picture, if you will, the final expedition. Not now, not yet, but in the near future, when the technology has advanced enough, when the political will has coalesced, when the funding has been secured and the teams assembled. Picture the ships breaking through the pack ice, the helicopters landing on the interior plateau, the drilling rigs being assembled under a sky so clear and cold it feels like vacuum. Picture the scientists, bundled against the cold, their breath freezing instantly, their movements slow and deliberate, because mistakes here are fatal. Picture the descent, the drill bit biting into ice, the weeks of waiting as the shaft deepens, the anticipation building. And then the breakthrough. The drill reaches bedrock. Cameras are lowered. Lights pierce the darkness for the first time in 12,000 years. And there, on the screens in the command tent, in the eyes of researchers around the world watching via satellite link, something appears. Not random geology, not natural rock formations, but a wall, corner, an angle that could not have been formed by wind or water or the slow movement of glaciers. An undeniable, unmistakable mark of intelligence, of intention, of human hands shaping stone. In that moment, everything changes. Every archaeologist, every historian, every anthropologist suddenly has to reevaluate their assumptions. Textbooks are rewritten. Timelines are revised. The story of humanity, the narrative we have taught for generations, is revealed to be incomplete, a chapter mistaken for the whole book. The news spreads within hours. The world watches. And for a brief, shining moment, humanity is united not by fear or conflict, but by wonder, by the shared realization that we are older, stranger, more mysterious than we knew. This is not fantasy. This is possibility. Every element of this scenario is within our current technological capability. We have the drills. We have the cameras. We have the radar that has already identified anomalies beneath the ice. All we lack is the decision to proceed, the collective will to commit the resources necessary to find out, once and for all, what lies beneath. And every year we delay, the ice changes, the climate shifts, the evidence, if it exists, becomes harder to preserve, harder to recover. But imagine, too, the alternative. Imagine the drill reaches bedrock and finds only stone. Smooth, unmarked, natural stone, shaped by geological forces but untouched by human hands. Imagine the disappointment, the sense of anticlimax, the skeptics vindicated, the believers silenced. Imagine the questions that would remain. Were the radar anomalies misinterpreted? Were the ancient maps coincidence? Were the myths just myths after all, with no basis in fact? And imagine how that, too, would be a kind of answer, a closing of a door, a resolution of uncertainty. We would know, at least, that Antarctica was never home to a lost civilization, that the continent has always been as it appears. Frozen, lifeless, inhospitable. We could stop wondering. We could move on. But could we? Or would the question linger, the nagging sense that we looked in the wrong place, drilled in the wrong location, that the city is still there, just a few miles away, still hidden, still waiting? Negative evidence is never as conclusive as positive evidence. You can prove something exists by finding it, but you cannot prove something does not exist by failing to find it. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. This is the frustration and the allure of the Antarctic mystery. Until we have explored every anomaly, drilled in every promising location, mapped every square mile of the subglacial bedrock, we cannot be certain. And the continent is vast, the ice is thick, and certainty may be forever out of reach. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, some questions meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the value is not in the answer but in the asking, not in the discovery but in the search. Perhaps the Antarctic civilization, whether it existed or not, serves a purpose simply by existing as a possibility, as a reminder that we do not know everything, that the past is deeper and stranger than we imagine, that there is always more to learn. This is the paradox at the heart of the Antarctic hypothesis. It is simultaneously compelling and unprovable, grounded in evidence yet requiring a leap of faith. It asks us to reconsider everything we think we know, but it offers no guarantees, no certainties, no easy answers. It is uncomfortable, unsettling, deeply challenging to the established narrative. And yet it persists. It resonates. It feels true on some level even when the rational mind rejects it. Why? Perhaps because we need it. We need the possibility that humanity is older, wiser, more resilient than the standard narrative suggests. We need the reminder that civilizations can fall, that knowledge can be lost, that we are not guaranteed survival. We need the humility that comes from confronting the unknown, from admitting that we do not have all the answers. And we need the wonder, the sense of awe, the recognition that the world is still full of mysteries, that there are still frontiers to explore, still questions to ask. Antarctica is that frontier. It is the last great unknown on Earth, the final blank space on the map. Not blank because nothing is there, but blank because we have not yet looked, have not yet had the courage or the technology or the will to find out. It is waiting, patient and silent, beneath 2 miles of ice. And whether it holds the ruins of a lost civilization or only ancient rock, it holds the potential to change us, to expand our understanding, to remind us that we are small and the universe is vast and there is always more to discover. The philosopher Heraclitus said that you cannot step into the same river twice, because the river is always changing, always flowing, never the same water from one moment to the next. This is true of history as well. The past is not static. It does not sit fixed and unchanging, waiting for us to discover it. It is constantly being reinterpreted, reevaluated, revised in light of new evidence, new methodologies, new questions. The history we teach today is not the history that was taught a century ago, and it will not be the history taught a century from now. This is not a failure of scholarship. It is the nature of the discipline. History is not about recovering the past as it truly was. That is impossible. It is about constructing narratives that make sense of the evidence we have, knowing that the evidence is incomplete and the narratives are provisional. The Antarctic hypothesis is part of this process. It is a narrative, a possible interpretation of fragmentary evidence, an attempt to make sense of anomalies that do not fit the standard timeline. It may be correct. It may be entirely wrong. But it is valuable regardless because it forces us to question our assumptions, to look more closely at the evidence, to consider possibilities we might otherwise dismiss. This is how knowledge advances, not through certainty but through doubt, through the willingness to challenge established ideas and explore uncomfortable alternatives. There is a risk, of course. The risk of pseudoscience, of wishful thinking, of seeing patterns that are not there and constructing elaborate theories on flimsy foundations. The history of archaeology is littered with such mistakes. Piltdown Man, the Cardiff Giant, the Crystal Skulls. Enthusiastic amateurs and unscrupulous frauds have claimed to find lost civilizations, ancient astronauts, evidence of Atlantis in locations ranging from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean to Antarctica itself. Most of these claims have been debunked. Most were based on misinterpretations, hoaxes, or outright fabrications. And so the scientific community is rightly skeptical, rightly cautious, rightly demanding of rigorous evidence before accepting extraordinary claims. But skepticism can become dogmatism. The demand for evidence can become an excuse for inaction. The fear of being wrong can prevent us from looking at all. There is a balance to be struck, and it is a delicate one. We must be skeptical, yes, but also open-minded. We must demand evidence, but also be willing to seek it out, to explore possibilities that seem unlikely, to test hypotheses that challenge the consensus. This is the scientific method at its best, not a set of rigid rules, but a flexible, iterative process of questioning, testing, revising, and refining. The Antarctic hypothesis deserves this kind of rigorous, open-minded examination. It should not be accepted uncritically, but neither should it be dismissed without investigation. The evidence is intriguing, if not conclusive. The questions are profound. The potential implications are enormous. We owe it to ourselves, to our ancestors, to our descendants, to find out whether there is any truth to it. And if there is not, if the ice yields only stone and silence, then we will have learned something valuable nonetheless. We will have tested the hypothesis, followed the evidence where it led, and come to a conclusion based on observation rather than assumption. That is how science works. That is how knowledge advances. And perhaps in the process we will discover something else. Perhaps, while searching for a lost civilization, we will learn more about ice dynamics, climate history, subglacial ecosystems. Perhaps we will develop new technologies for exploring extreme environments, technologies that will have applications beyond Antarctica. Perhaps we will gain insights into how ancient peoples adapted to hostile climates, insights that will help us adapt to the climate changes we are causing today. Science is rarely a straight line from question to answer. It is a web, a network of interconnected inquiries, each one leading to others, each discovery opening new questions. The search for the Antarctic civilization, even if unsuccessful in its primary goal, will yield secondary discoveries, unexpected insights, advances in knowledge that we cannot predict. This is the beauty and the frustration of exploration. You never know what you will find until you look. You cannot predict the outcome, cannot guarantee success, cannot eliminate risk. All you can do is ask the question, design the best methodology you can, commit the necessary resources, and see what happens. Sometimes you find exactly what you were looking for. Sometimes you find nothing. And sometimes you find something entirely unexpected, something that changes the question, redirects the search, opens vistas you did not know existed. Antarctica is full of such potential. It is a continent we have barely scratched the surface of, a place where every expedition returns with new data, new questions, new mysteries. The more we learn, the more we realize how little we know. This is not discouraging. This is exhilarating. It means there is always more to discover, always deeper to go, always further to explore. It means the story is not over, the book is not closed, the final chapter has not been written. And so we return again and again to the central question. What if Antarctica was the first capital of humanity? What if the oldest city on Earth is buried beneath the ice, waiting for us to find it? What if our history is not what we think it is, not a linear progression from primitive to advanced, but a cycle of rise and fall, of knowledge gained and lost and recovered? What if we are not the first, but the latest, not the inventors but the inheritors, not the pioneers but the descendants of pioneers who came before? These are not idle questions. They touch on the deepest issues of human identity, human purpose, human destiny. They force us to confront our mortality, our fragility, our place in the vast sweep of time. They remind us that we are not the center of the universe, not the culmination of history, not guaranteed survival. But they also remind us of our resilience, our curiosity, our relentless drive to understand, to explore, to push beyond the boundaries of the known. There is a concept in quantum physics called superposition, the idea that a particle can exist in multiple states simultaneously until it is observed, at which point it collapses into a single state. Before observation, all possibilities coexist. After observation, only one remains. The Antarctic civilization, in a sense, exists in superposition. Until we drill through the ice, until we excavate the bedrock, until we observe directly, it both exists and does not exist. All possibilities are open. The city is there and it is not there. The history is real and it is myth. We hold both possibilities in our minds, and the tension between them is what drives the search. But observation comes at a cost. Once we look, once we drill and excavate and examine, the superposition collapses. We will have an answer, and the answer will foreclose other possibilities. If we find the city, we cannot unfind it. If we find nothing, the mystery is diminished, the wonder reduced. There is a purity to the unanswered question, a freedom in not knowing. Once the question is answered, that freedom is lost. We are locked into a particular narrative, a specific understanding, a single collapse state. Is this why we hesitate? Is this why, despite the technology, despite the evidence, despite the profound implications, we have not yet committed fully to the search? Are we, on some level, reluctant to collapse the superposition, to give up the possibilities for a single certainty? Perhaps. There is comfort in mystery, in the unknown, in the sense that anything is possible. And there is discomfort in answers because answers bring responsibility. If we discover a lost civilization, we must reckon with what it means. If we discover nothing, we must reckon with that as well. But we cannot remain in superposition forever. The ice is melting. The climate is changing. Time is forcing the collapse whether we choose it or not. We will lose the opportunity to preserve whatever is beneath the ice, if we do not act. And so the choice is not whether to observe, but when. Will we do it deliberately, carefully, scientifically? Or will we let climate change do it for us, in a chaotic, uncontrolled way that may destroy evidence even as it reveals it? The responsible choice is clear. We must explore Antarctica not despite the risks, but because of them. We must commit the resources, the technology, the international cooperation necessary to search for the truth, whatever it may be. We must be prepared for disappointment, for ambiguity, for answers that raise more questions than they resolve. But we must look, because the alternative, to ignore the evidence, to dismiss the questions, to let the ice keep its secrets, is not neutrality. It is a choice, and it is the wrong choice. The story of the Antarctic civilization, whether true or false, is ultimately a story about us. It is about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget, what we value enough to preserve and what we allow to slip away. It is about our relationship with the past, our responsibility to the future, our willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. If Antarctica holds the ruins of a lost civilization, then we owe it to those who built it to remember them, to honor their achievement, to learn from their fate. And if Antarctica holds only stone, we owe it to ourselves to know that, to accept it, to stop wondering and move on to other questions. But we cannot know without looking, and looking requires courage. The courage to challenge accepted narratives, to pursue unlikely hypotheses, to commit resources to uncertain outcomes. The courage to be wrong, to face ridicule, to accept that some questions may never be fully answered. The courage to change our minds, to revise our understanding, to admit that we do not have all the answers and never will. This is the courage that defines science, that drives exploration, that has pushed humanity from the caves to the stars. Antarctica is the ultimate test of that courage. It is the hardest place on Earth to explore, the most expensive, the most technically challenging. It offers no guarantees, no easy answers, no immediate rewards. But it offers something more valuable. The possibility of understanding, the chance to learn, the opportunity to recover a piece of our past that has been lost for 12,000 years or more. That possibility is worth the risk. That chance is worth the cost. That opportunity is worth the effort. And so the search continues. Not as quickly as some would like, not as thoroughly as the questions demand, but it continues. Radar surveys map more of the subglacial terrain. Drilling projects probe deeper into the ice. Climate scientists monitor the changes, the melting, the retreat of glaciers that may expose what has been hidden. Slowly, patiently, methodically, we are peeling back the layers, approaching the moment when the superposition collapses and we finally know. What will we find? A city, frozen and perfect, its streets and buildings preserved as if time stopped, or only rock, ancient and indifferent, shaped by geology and untouched by human hands? We do not know. But soon, within our lifetimes perhaps, we will. And when that moment comes, when the cameras descend into the darkness and the lights reveal what has been hidden beneath the ice, the world will hold its breath. Because whatever we find, whatever the answer, it will change us. It will expand our understanding of history, of humanity, of our place in the long arc of time. It will challenge us, humble us, perhaps frighten us. But it will also remind us of what we are capable of the curiosity that drives us, the intelligence that defines us, the courage that propels us forward into the unknown. Antarctica is waiting, the ice is patient, and we, the seekers, the questioners, the descendants of those who looked at the horizon and wondered what lay beyond, we are preparing to answer the question that has haunted us for generations. What if Antarctica was the first capital of humanity? Soon we will know. Close your eyes and imagine the moment after. The discovery has been made, the evidence examined, the conclusions drawn. Imagine the news spreading across the world, carried by satellites and fiber optic cables, translated into every language, debated in every forum. Imagine the reactions: wonder, disbelief, excitement, fear. Imagine the questions that will follow, the implications that will unfold, the ways in which this single discovery will ripple through every aspect of human thought. If we find the city, if Antarctica is confirmed as the site of the first human capital, then history is rewritten. But it is not just history that changes. Philosophy must grapple with the cyclical nature of civilization, the evidence that progress is not guaranteed, that knowledge can be lost, that we have been here before. Religion must confront the possibility that creation myths, flood narratives, and stories of lost golden ages are not divine revelations but cultural memories of real events. Science must reevaluate the timeline of human development, the spread of technology, the origins of agriculture and writing and astronomy. Education systems will need to be revised. Textbooks will be rewritten. Children will grow up learning a different story about where they came from, a story that is older, more complex, more humbling than the one their parents learned. The implications for national identity, for cultural pride, for the stories we tell about ourselves are profound. If Antarctica was the first capital, then no modern nation can claim to be the cradle of civilization. We are all descendants of refugees, all inheritors of a knowledge that was forged in the ice and carried north when the world changed. But beyond the practical, beyond the political, beyond the academic, there is the psychological impact. The knowledge that we have risen and fallen before changes how we think about the future. It undermines the assumption of progress, the belief that we are inevitably ascending towards some higher state. It forces us to confront the fragility of our achievements, the temporary nature of our cities, the possibility that everything we build might one day be buried, forgotten, reduced to anomalies that future archaeologists will struggle to interpret. This is not a comfortable realization. It is easier to believe that we are unique, that our civilization is different, that we have learned from the past and will not repeat its mistakes. But if Antarctica was the first capital, then we are forced to accept that we are not unique, that our civilization is one among many, that the forces that destroyed the past can destroy us as well. Climate change, in particular, becomes not an abstract future threat but a present reality, a repetition of what has happened before. The ice advanced once, can advance again, or the seas can rise, or the climate can shift, or some other force we have not anticipated can disrupt the delicate balance that sustains us. But there is also empowerment in this knowledge. If we have survived before, we can survive again. If knowledge was lost and recovered, then preservation becomes a moral imperative. We must build systems to ensure that what we know does not disappear with us. We must create archives that can survive catastrophe, knowledge encoded in forms that future generations can access even if our current systems fail. Stone monuments, like those our ancestors built, that can convey essential information without language. Genetic archives, embedding knowledge in DNA that can persist for millennia. Oral traditions, stories that carry truth even when the context is lost. Digital archives, yes, but also analog backups, multiple redundancies, distributed systems that cannot be destroyed by a single event. We must also think differently about our relationship with the environment. If climate change destroyed the Antarctic civilization, then it can destroy ours. The difference is that we, unlike them, can see it coming. We have the scientific understanding, the technological capability, the global communication necessary to respond. Whether we will actually respond, whether we will act in time, whether we will make the sacrifices necessary to preserve a livable planet, these are open questions. But the knowledge that others failed, that a previous civilization was unable to adapt when the climate shifted, should motivate us. It should terrify us. And it should inspire us to do better, to be the first human civilization that survives its own environmental crisis. The search for the Antarctic civilization is, in the end, a search for wisdom. Not just the knowledge of what happened, but the wisdom to apply that knowledge, to learn from the past, to avoid repeating its mistakes. This is why it matters. This is why we must continue the search, must commit the resources, must have the courage to confront what we might find. Because the past is not dead. It is not even past. It is present, encoded in our genes, embedded in our myths, frozen beneath the ice, waiting to teach us if we are willing to learn. And so we ask again, one final time, what if Antarctica was the first capital of humanity? What if the oldest city on Earth is not a metaphor but a reality, not a myth but a memory, not a fantasy but a frozen truth waiting to be discovered? What if our history is deeper, stranger, more fragile than we imagine? And what if, By seeking the answer to this question, we not only recover our past but also secure our future. These are the questions that drive us. These are the reasons we explore. Not for glory, not for wealth, not for conquest, but for understanding. Because we are human, and understanding is what we do. We ask questions. We seek answers. We look at the unknown and refuse to turn away. This is our nature. This is our gift. And this is our responsibility, to ourselves, to our ancestors, to our descendants, to all the generations past and future who are part of the long, unbroken chain of human existence. Antarctica is waiting. The ice is melting. And we, the seekers, are preparing to answer the question. Soon, perhaps very soon, we will know. And when we do, when the truth is finally revealed, we will carry that knowledge forward, adding it to the long record of what we have learned, what we have survived, what we have become. The story continues. The search goes on. And the ice, patient and silent, holds its secrets still.